When America made drinking illegal, everything went wrong. It was January 1920. The bitter winter wind swept through the streets of a small town in the heart of America. An ordinary manor worker, a family man, pushed open the door of his favorite bar, the same establishment he had frequented for 20 years, where his father had drunk before him. When he ordered a beer, a gesture as automatic as breathing, the bartender looked around, lowered his voice, and said, "I can't serve that anymore. It's against the law now." Within hours, what had been routine had become rebellion. What had been commerce had become contraband. And what had been law was about to create the greatest era of organized crime the United States had ever known. This is the story of Prohibition, not told through the headlines of New York or Chicago, but through the quiet streets and divided consciences of small-town America. But before we get into this story, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel. To understand what happened in America's small towns during Prohibition, we must first understand the world that existed before it. The 1920s promised to be an era of unprecedented transformation. The Great War had ended. Millions of soldiers were returning home, carrying dreams of a better life. Electricity was beginning to illuminate homes that had known only candlelight. The automobile was reshaping not just the roads, but the very social geography of America. Radio brought distant voices into living rooms. Cinema transformed actors into gods worshipped by millions. It was an age of dizzying optimism, of possibilities that seemed endless. But behind this promise of modernity, a silent contradiction was taking hold in the nation's heart. For decades, temperance movements had preached against the evils of alcohol. Led by women in religious groups, they argued that drink was the root of all social ills, from domestic violence to poverty, from crime to moral degradation. And on January 17, 1920, those movements finally won. The 18th Amendment went into effect, and the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages became illegal throughout American territory. President Herbert Hoover called Prohibition a great social and economic experiment, noble in motive and far-reaching in purpose. He could not have been more wrong about its results. What followed was not an era of sobriety and virtue. It was an era of shadows, of basements transformed into forbidden sanctuaries, of small towns divided between written law and lived reality, of criminals who became businessmen and businessmen who became criminals. When the clock struck midnight on January 17, 1920, a strange silence descended upon the bars and taverns of thousands of small American towns. Bottles were hidden in barns, buried in backyards, emptied into rivers. Beer barrels were dumped into roadside ditches, and men who had never broken a law in their lives woke up on that cold January morning as potential criminals. In the weeks leading up to that fateful midnight, there had been a desperate rush. Those with means bought every drop of alcohol they could find. The price of whiskey tripled in the final days of legality. Doctors were besieged with requests for medicinal alcohol. Prescriptions, one of the few loopholes the law allowed. Prohibition was not a smooth transition. It was an abrupt severing of centuries-old traditions, of local economies, of social rituals that defined entire communities. The town bar was not just a place to drink. It was where farmers discussed wheat prices, where merchants sealed deals with a handshake, where young men learned to be men, listening to the stories of their elders. Overnight, all of this became illegal. For many Americans, this marked the beginning of an era of distrust. Neighbors informed on neighbors for government rewards. The sheriff who was supposed to enforce the law often drank with the same men he was now supposed to arrest. The pastor who preached against the evils of alcohol knew that half his congregation had bottles hidden at home. Hypocrisy became not just common, but necessary for social survival. In major urban centers, Prohibition was front-page news, the subject of fiery editorials. But in small towns across rural America, it was a different kind of battle, fought in silence, behind closed doors, in the everyday decisions of ordinary people. Many shopkeepers simply refused to stop selling alcohol, not out of grand ideology, but out of survival. The corner bar was not just a business, it was often a family's only source of income. It was the community's gathering place, the collective living room of an entire town. Closing its doors meant destroying a social fabric woven over decades. And so, the resistance began. Quiet, almost invisible, but deeply rooted. And I understand your reluctance to subscribe, so please subscribe to the channel and comment on which city you're watching from. In some towns, merchants developed elaborate warning systems. A bell rung in a certain way meant federal agents had been spotted on the main road. A flag in a window indicated whether it was safe to do business that day. Children were recruited as lookouts, earning pennies to watch for unfamiliar cars. This resistance, however, came at a price. Specialized agents from the Bureau of Prohibition began sweeping through the countryside with almost religious zeal. They visited bars, restaurants, hotels, pharmacies, and grocery stores. They confiscated goods, imposed heavy fines, and dragged respectable business owners before federal courts. The initial enforcement was relentless, and it made clear that the new law would not simply be a suggestion to be ignored. Prohibition's supporters promised a transformed America, a safer, more productive, more moral nation. Stronger families, more efficient factories, emptier prisons. The numbers told a completely different story. In the first 2 years of Prohibition, the 30 largest cities in the country witnessed a 24% increase in overall crime rates. Nota de creas an explosion that surprised even the most pessimistic critics. Homicides rose by 13%. Shootings became regular occurrences in cities that had known relative peace. Assaults increased at the same rate. Bar fights did not disappear with the bars. They simply became more violent, fought in dark alleys and clandestine basements where no authority could intervene. But it was in drug-related crimes that the numbers became truly alarming, a 45% increase. Historians debate their reasons. Some argue that those deprived of alcohol sought alternative substances. Others suggest that criminal networks diversified their products. The result was undeniable. Prohibition had not created a more sober America. It had created a more addicted one. And the costs of maintaining order, they increased by nearly 12%. More police officers, more equipment, more funerals for agents killed in the line of duty. The noble experiment was proving extraordinarily expensive, not just in dollars, but in human lives. In small towns, where police departments consisted of a sheriff and maybe 2 deputies, there were no resources to combat large-scale smuggling. The choice was brutal: enforce the law and become a pariah, or look the other way and keep the peace. Where there is prohibition, there is opportunity. And where there is opportunity, men emerge willing to seize it no matter the cost. Prohibition created an economic power vacuum of monumental proportions. Overnight, a billion-dollar industry was pushed into illegal. Demand did not disappear. Americans did not stop drinking. They simply stopped drinking legally, and someone had to supply that demand. That vacuum was filled by criminal organizations that operated with the efficiency of modern corporations. What had been disorganized street gangs transformed into true business empires, with logistics departments, accounting divisions, and strategies that would have impressed Wall Street executives. In Chicago, Al Capone built an empire valued at over $100 million annually. At a time when the average worker earned less than $2,000 a year, Capone was amassing fortunes that rivaled those of America's greatest industrialists. His empire controlled the production, transportation, and distribution of illegal beverages, operating with thousands of employees and a network of bribes that reached high-ranking politicians. Capone was not just a criminal, he was a celebrity. His expensive suits, his imported cigars, his calculated generosity transformed him into an almost folkloric figure. But I know something that can help you become a celebrity. Just like and subscribe to the channel. Now that's more like it. He opened soup kitchens for the unemployed while ordering the murder of rivals. He donated to orphans while corrupting judges. He was the perfect product of an era of contradictions. In New York, Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky were building their own empires. In Detroit, the Purple Gang controlled smuggling from Canada, and the reach of these organizations extended to the smallest rural communities. Farmers were recruited to hide shipments. Sheriffs received envelopes in exchange for convenient blindness. Prohibition had handed control of alcohol to the worst elements of American society. For the millions of Americans who still wanted a drink after a long day's work, the solution came in the form of a whispered word, speakeasy. The term literally meant speak quietly, a practical instruction that became the name of an entire cultural phenomenon. It is estimated that at the height of Prohibition, there were over 100,000 speakeasies in New York City alone, more than double the number of legal bars before the dry law. And for every sophisticated Manhattan speakeasy, with its jazz shows, there were dozens of modest operations in small towns. An unmarked door at the back of a barbershop, a staircase descending to the basement of a hardware store, a seemingly abandoned barn, a specifico de 3 knocks, pause, 2 knocks, that opened invisible doors. Inside, the atmosphere was often simple: tables, rickety chairs, dim lighting to hide both the quality of the drinks and the faces of the patrons. But there was something these places shared: a sense of community forged in shared transgression. Speakeasies were not just places to consume alcohol, they were spaces of social transformation. For the first time in American history, men and women drank together in public, as equals. The rigid rules of the Victorian era began to crumble in America's clandestine basements. Women who would never have entered a traditional saloon frequented speakeasies without scandal. Shared danger created intimacy. When everyone is committing the same crime, class barriers disappear. The banker sat beside the mechanic. The doctor shared a table with the butcher. Illegality had become a great social equalizer. For the young people of the era, frequenting a speakeasy was not just about alcohol, it was about rebellion, about rejecting the rules of a generation that had created impossible laws. If Prohibition was the law that defined the 1920s, the flapper was the woman who defied it. They appeared in speakeasies with short hair, a scandal in itself, since long hair had been a symbol of femininity for generations. They wore dresses that ended at the knee, revealing more leg than any previous generation had dared to show. They smoked cigarettes in long holders. They drank cocktails. They danced the Charleston until dawn. And, to their parents' horror, they seemed not to care what society thought. The flapper was more than fashion. She was a statement. The old rules no longer applied. Women could be as free, as bold as men had always been. In an era that tried to prohibit pleasure through law, the flapper celebrated pleasure as a political act. Prohibition, ironically, accelerated this revolution. Before the dry law, saloons were exclusively male spaces. Respectable women did not enter, but speakeasies operated outside traditional norms. If they were already breaking the law by serving drinks, what difference did it make to serve women? America's clandestine basements became the first truly gender-integrated public spaces. In small towns, this transformation was particularly shocking. Communities where women still wore ankle-length dresses saw their daughters return from big cities with scandalous ideas. Sermons were preached against the modern woman. Editorials lamented the moral degradation of youth. But the tide was impossible to hold back. The flapper did not survive the decade. The Great Depression killed the optimism that had fueled her. But the idea that women could define their own terms, that survived, flourished, and transformed the world. The 1920s became known as the Roaring Twenties, an era of jazz and diamonds, of parties until dawn. But behind the glamour, deep shadows moved. Even as women shortened their dresses and couples danced the Charleston, conservative waves swept across the country. It was an era of impossible extremes, of contradictions that coexisted without reconciling. The Ku Klux Klan, nearly extinct after the Civil War, resurged with renewed force. At its peak, the organization had millions of members, not just in the South, but across the entire country. And among its causes, the Klan fervently embraced Prohibition. For the Klan, the dry law was not just about alcohol, it was about social control, about imposing a specific vision of America. White, Protestant, rural, European immigrants, Italians, Irish, Jews, were seen as threats. And those immigrants drank in their ethnic bars, in their cultural celebrations. Alcohol, in the Klan's view, was foreign corruption. Law enforcement became deeply unequal. A speakeasy frequented by the white elite could operate for years without interference, while a bar serving immigrant workers would be shut down in the first week. Prohibition became a tool of persecution as much as morality. The prohibition of alcohol did not eliminate its consumption. It simply pushed it underground, and that underground moved fortunes. The black market generated billions of dollars money that fed criminal empires and corrupted the very institutions charged with enforcing the law. In an era before the modern income tax, the government lost one of its main sources of revenue. Bootleggers operated on multiple fronts. They smuggled from Canada, by land, water, and air. From the Caribbean, shipments landed on deserted Florida beaches. Clandestine distilleries sprang up in barns, basements, and isolated cabins. You know what else can come from anywhere? Your like. Leave a like and comment on where you're watching from. Quality varied. Some producers were trained master brewers. Others were amateurs whose products could kill. Others exploited legal loopholes. Doctors prescribed medicinal alcohol, a loophole exploited to absurdity. Pharmacies sold suspiciously alcoholic tonics. Churches used sacramental wine, and some congregations grew dramatically during Prohibition. In small towns, this parallel economy had familiar faces. The farmer who had been distilling for generations became a lucrative supplier. The grocery store owner turned his warehouse into a distribution point. The sheriff received discreet envelopes. Prohibition did not just create criminals, it created a culture of complicity that permeated every level of society. For those who were caught, The consequences were severe. Fines that ruined families, prison sentences that destroyed reputations, confiscated businesses, names printed in newspapers, forever branded as criminals. In small towns, where everyone knew everyone, being caught violating the dry law was a social death sentence. The stigma haunted families for generations. Sons of imprisoned men grew up under shadows of shame. Marriages were destroyed, friendships evaporated, but there was an even more terrible price. The physical one, with legal production prohibited, beverages of dubious origin flooded the market. Poorly made homemade spirits, contaminated with methanol, a lethal industrial alcohol, blinded and killed thousands of Americans. Some poisonings were accidental, ignorant producers who did not understand the dangerous chemistry. Others were deliberate. Industrial alcohol resold as drink. Approximately 10,000 Americans died from alcohol poisoning during Prohibition. Thousands more were permanently blinded or suffered irreversible neurological damage. The law created to protect public health became a death sentence for many who simply sought a simple pleasure. And the government knew. Documents showed that authorities viewed the deaths as a deterrent to illegal consumption. It was a logic that treated the death of citizens as an instrument of public policy. 13 years. That is how long it took America to admit the experiment had failed. 13 years of rising crime, of gangster fortunes, of systemic corruption, of preventable deaths. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, arguments against Prohibition gained new urgency. In a nation with millions unemployed and starving, the beverage industry represented a promise of jobs, of taxes, of revenue for a bankrupt government. In December 1933, the 21st Amendment was ratified, repealing the 18th. It was the first time in American history that a constitutional amendment had been overturned by another, an extraordinary acknowledgement of error, a nation admitting it had attempted the impossible. But the federal end did not mean a universal one. Many states, especially in the Deep South, maintained their own dry laws for decades. Dry counties still exist in parts of the United States today. Mississippi, the most resistant of all, only repealed its state prohibition in 1966, more than 3 decades after the rest of the country. In the small towns of those states, the Prohibition era extended far beyond its official end, a reminder that laws can be repealed, but mindsets change slowly. Prohibition ended nearly a century ago. The speakeasies closed their doors. The great gangsters died, some in shootouts, others in prisons, others in hospital beds. The flappers put away their short dresses and became grandmothers. Jazz migrated from basements to respectable stages. But the scars remain visible. The organized crime that flourished during those 13 years was never dismantled. It simply evolved. The structures created by Capone adapted to new markets: drugs, gambling, prostitution, extortion. The American Mafia, marginal before Prohibition, emerged as a permanent institution with ramifications that extend to this day. The lessons remain relevant. In contemporary debates about drugs, about any behavior governments try to prohibit by decree, the echoes of Prohibition resound. The fundamental question remains: can a law change human nature? And if it cannot, what is the cost of trying? In America's small towns, stories are still told about the great-grandfather who hid battles in the barn during a federal raid, about the speakeasy that operated where a diner stands today, about the great-grandmother who sewed secret pockets in her dresses to transport bottles, about the sheriff who chose community over law, or about the one who made the opposite choice and was never forgiven. Looking back, it is easy to see Prohibition as an obvious mistake, a law doomed to fail, but that would be unfair to those who lived through that era. Prohibition supporters were not monsters or fools. Many were sincere reformers, horrified by the poverty and violence surrounding alcohol consumption. Wives beaten by drunken husbands, children who went hungry because their father's paycheck disappeared at the bar. Communities devastated by alcoholism. Their error was not in intention. It was in believing that a law could solve a problem that was fundamentally human. And for those who lived under Prohibition, in the great cities and the forgotten small towns, it was not an abstract concept. It was real, present, transformative. It changed local economies. It destroyed the lives of people who had been respectable citizens. It created criminal empires. It forced millions of ordinary Americans to make choices they never imagined having to make. The history of Prohibition reminds us of uncomfortable truths. That laws written in distant capitals are lived on local streets by people whose circumstances legislators never considered. That good intentions do not always produce good results. that prohibiting something does not eliminate it, it simply pushes it into shadows where it flourishes without control, and that human nature finds ways, legal or not, to be what it has always been. Prohibition was not just a chapter in American history. It was a mirror that reflected the deepest contradictions of a nation divided between freedom and control, between law and conscience. The speakeasies may have closed, the bootleggers may have disappeared, but the tension that Prohibition exposed remains alive. It pulses beneath the surface of dozens of contemporary debates, and it will likely continue as long as there are governments that try to prohibit and citizens who refuse to obey. If this journey through the past has touched you in any way, consider subscribing to the channel. Every subscription helps us continue bringing forgotten stories back into the light. If this journey through the past has touched you in any way, consider subscribing to the channel. Every subscription helps us continue bringing forgotten stories back into the light. Leave a comment telling us which aspect of the Prohibition era surprised you most. Maybe it was the scale of the crime, maybe the social transformation of the maybe the stories of resistance in small towns. We want to know what resonated with you, and what other historical periods you would like to explore with us. History never ends, it simply waits to be told again. Until next time.